so I've disagreed plenty of times with Jinsarai 1 in the past, either leaving very long comments on his videos or telling him over internet conversation. But perhaps my biggest grievance was with his Vader vs Yoda video. Many people have asked my opinion about that video, but when it was deleted, I didn't see a point to it. Well, one of my commenters let me know that it was up again, as I thought it wasn't, so I guess it's time for me to make an official rebuttal to it. I also hope this video works as an example of how to counter someone on YouTube or anywhere online. Comments like this are not the answer, and it's something I do not tolerate on my own channel. The Unknown Trooper speaks from my mind. Get the f out. I disagree with his video, but I still respect his opinion. If you have no respect, this video is not for you. I'm not having you come here to use it as some sort of fuel against Jinsarai.
Earnestness crept into his voice. That's just schooling, Barris. It's all theory and supposition, even if it's being taught by Master Yoda. It's not real fighting.
He uses this quote to downplay Yoda by saying that what Anakin proclaims is truth. That Yoda is merely a school teacher who is fine at teaching, but his instruction is only good for the classroom, not real active combat. Let's give this quote some context. It comes from the Approaching Storm novel, which in the timeline of the lore, takes place just before the events of Attack of the Clones. Anakin Skywalker, as we will come to know in that film and from this book, is extremely conceited and feels he is above many other Jedi, including his master.
In some ways, a lot of ways, I'm really ahead of him.
Anakin even goes on to compare himself to Yoda in the opening scenes of that film.
You spent as much time practicing your saber techniques as you do your wit. You would rival Master Yoda as a swordsman.
I thought I already did.
Only in your mind, my very young apprentice.
Anakin may respect Yoda as a great Jedi instructor, but he does not respect his lightsaber skills. Now let's be fair, Anakin and many other Jedi who know Yoda in this time period have never actually seen Yoda fight in active combat, only in sparring sessions and demonstrations. That much is clear in the passage read by Jinsarai in The Approaching Storm. That's fine. But let's not forget what happened to Anakin and all his confidence at the end of the movie, mere weeks after he made this comment to Barris within the lore. Let's also not forget who saved him, Yoda, the Jedi who Anakin thought would never amount to much in a real lightsaber duel. I don't want to take anything away from Anakin, who tends to get underrated as a Padawan within the YouTube community, as I do think he does back up most of his talent. As indicated in the novelization, he did better against Dooku than Obi-Wan. Dooku actually had to shake off his own conceit and take Anakin seriously, but as Dooku would muse within the prose, neither Obi-Wan or even Anakin were anywhere near Yoda's level. In fact, Dooku completely alters his more nuanced style to match Yoda.
Fought well you have, my old Padawan.
After the fight is over, I'm very sure Anakin would sing a very different tune about Yoda and what he said in The Approaching Storm, something that was said from both arrogance and ignorance. In fact, Alan Dean Foster, the book's author, lightly planted that very scene, knowing the events of Attack of the Clones, writing a narrative that Anakin would learn from in the movie, given greater context.
Of course I had classes with him, and I agree that he's a fine teacher of technique.
To set up that quote in a matchup that most already knew Jinsarai would give to Vader seems a bit questionable from the start. In a way, to me, it shows Jinsarai's bias against Yoda by using a quote said by a younger Padawan Anakin that came from ignorance, without recognizing the outcome of that ignorance. The poetic justice is that it would be Yoda's textbook style that would end up saving him.
Vader leverages his strength so as to subvert agility by off-balancing opponents.
Levering strength to subvert agility works on someone as novice as Luke, or someone of a similar stature. But Yoda is an extremely small target. Leveraging strength against him is not going to work so easily for Vader, just as it wasn't for Dooku or Sidious or even Mace Windu. This leverage did not help Vader against those who have landed strikes against him, as admitted by Jinsarai at the 625 mark in his video.
Vader's stilted movements made him easy to dodge around and evade, a weakness that has allowed various adversaries to score hits on him.
There's a comment on his video from Mob Flork that I agree with. The video does not note that Vader would have difficulty controlling the fight in a physical way, because the proportions of Yoda are much different from a standard humanoid. I don't agree that Vader has absolutely no way to attack Yoda, as the commenter would suggest here, but Vader would have a lot of difficulties doing so.
His active defense is perfectly suited to neutralizing Yoda's intense physical assault.
An active defense on Vader's part would mean he would have to be able to contend with Yoda's speed. We have seen in his fights with Starkiller, which he showed in his video, that he could not contend with Starkiller on the basis of speed itself. Sure, Starkiller was not able to steamroll through Vader right off the bat, but the Force Unleashed novelization makes note that Vader's lightsaber was eventually and simply too slow to match Starkiller. And from the description of the fight, Starkiller seemed to be having a stand-up fight with Vader, no flank subversion, as Yoda would be applying against the Juggernaut, which would be even more effective. If Starkiller, a Jedi whose speed was no greater than Yoda, could strike Vader down through a speed-based strike, so too should Yoda with an easier effort. And the main argument one has to buy for this to work is that Yoda would be incapable of subverting Vader at all. Even a Padawan-level Luke Skywalker was able to subvert Vader through his acrobatics, which was solidified again a year later in Return of the Jedi. If these dudes can successfully outmaneuver Vader, so too should Yoda.
Vader's lightsaber-resistant armor provides him with a margin for error that Yoda simply doesn't have.
The next point we have here is the notion that Vader's lightsaber-resistant armor could hold up under an assault from Yoda. So let's examine if that's really the case. Rowan Shrine tried to cut through Vader's hand, but was blocked. Vader was visibly damaged but pressed on. Yet in the movies, Luke was able to cut straight through the gloves. Starkiller was able to cut through Vader's chest in their duel, and a thrown lightsaber in Star Wars Purge went through his mask. We have also seen Ahsoka cutting through Vader's mask. The only part of Vader that seems to have consistent resistance to lightsabers are his pauldrons, and even that can cause damage to him. But that's it. In Empire Strikes Back, if Luke had continued his assault, where Vader took time to yell at being hit at his pauldron, he could have capitalized on that shortcoming of Vader. That's something I believe Yoda would continue doing, as he is a flurry of speed. He would not tag Vader and then stop and run away. He would tag Vader and continue with his assault. Much in the same way Yoda continued his assault against Dooku and Dark Rendezvous, where it was described that Yoda's blade was just a huge whirlwind of green, and that the green shined brighter than Dooku's lightsaber. In other duels we've seen Yoda in, the ones in which he disarmed Sidious came near the wrist and hand, where we have seen is a very vulnerable spot for Vader. And as we've seen many times with Vader, he has lost many robotic hands. So Vader's armor can be deemed as lightsaber resistant, but only consistently at the pauldrons. The other scans that he shows of people cutting Vader were grazing wounds rather than effective cuts. If Yoda were to strike anywhere but Vader's pauldrons, he would likely be cut through clean,
allowing him to drive Count Dooku into a retreat on 2 separate occasions and seize a dominant edge against Darth Sidious, who aborted the duel and unleashed his raw force power.
Slight correction here, Palpatine did not actively abort his lightsaber duel with Yoda, as Jin Sarai suggests. He was actively disarmed by Yoda. He was actively forced out of his engagement. As I've covered in my videos featuring Yoda, Yoda's only true challenger was in Darth Sidious, who he also outfought by way of his blade. But wait, Antoine, that never happened in the movie. True. In the movie, Yoda and Palpatine's fight is cut short to emphasize the bout between Kenobi and Skywalker, so we never see Yoda disarm Sidious on screen. But when we return to their fight, Sidious is without his lightsaber. Where did it go? The answer comes by way of the novelization and the screenplay, both showcasing Yoda disarming the Dark Lord of his blade. After redoubling the speed of his blows, also keep that in mind again for Yoda's speed, forced Palpatine's saber from his hands. The fact that Jin Sarai does not mention this, though he is well aware of it, especially when he uses novel material to supplement most of his analysis, feels deliberately dismissive.
However, all of Yoda's advantages came with drawbacks. As all of his attacks are performed as leaping spins, this means that his attack vectors are restricted by his angle of rotation. If he is spinning from left to right, then until he has a chance to reorient his spin, he can only attack from left to right.
You'll hear this argument a lot from Jin Sarai and Evan Nova, the drawbacks of the Suma rotations for Yoda. You'll notice that when he talks about this, he speaks about it in theory, but never in application. For one, Yoda is not limited by left and right maneuvers, as he would suggest. These cuts can be applied with slight vertical angle changes by simply adjusting one's wrist. Further, each opponent who has faced Yoda, knowing his style, could not subvert this. So there is nothing solid backing up this notion that Yoda's rotations have been a negative effect against his opponents.
And the unspoken weakness of a fighting style based around generating momentum and power with flying acrobatics is that if Yoda ever came up against something he couldn't knock aside or cleave through, he'd simply bounce off.
But Yoda does not fight this way. He does not knock aside or cleave through like a Vader. Ataru is about flank subversion, not direct assaults like a Jimso specialist. If Yoda is employing his technique correctly, he should not be meeting walls like this because he is sliding through his cuts, not statically pounding. To suggest from this image at 21:19 that somehow Yoda simply bounced off Sidious in his lightsaber duel feels a bit misleading. Again, I already covered what happened between Sidious and Yoda in their lightsaber confrontation.
So the basic fact of the matter is that he is completely unaware of his own weaknesses.
Unaware of his weaknesses? Not so much. Jinsarai even quotes Mace Windu earlier in this video about how Yoda specifically uses Ataru to compensate for his weaknesses. I would say the Grandmaster was very aware of his potential shortcomings. That's why his fight style is designed the way it is. He knows he can't carry on an extended marathon fight. Though I think his levels of stamina are often downplayed. As I've said before in my other videos, his fight with Sidious nearly goes on as long as Anakin and Obi-Wan's. Still, Yoda knows he needs to end things quickly, and he has to supplement for his small stature. To say he is unaware of this weakness goes against why he does what he does to begin with. This again is on the false narrative that Sidious deliberately removed himself from the lightsaber duel against Yoda in order to exploit Yoda's weaknesses. You'll find nothing to back this up in the comics, movies, or novels which directly contradict this.
He either overwhelms you, or he doesn't.
But when has he ever not outdueled his opponent? When has he ever come close to not doing so? Answer: never.
Grandmaster Yoda was fluid and powerful, perfection of form, a whirling dervish with a lightsaber. However, he was unimaginative and wielded his mastery of the art in a narrow fashion.
Unimaginative and wielding his lightsaber in a narrow fashion? This sort of mentality is exactly why I put a sequence like this in my Yoda video. But what makes Yoda so great? Why could none of his adversaries beat him by way of the blade? There is this misconception that he is limited by a textbook and predictable application of Ataru. Yet Dooku, who also mastered and had knowledge of all forms, as seen from his training of General Grievous, could not predict nor contend with Yoda, and neither could Sidious, because Yoda had fundamentals and subtlety down to a science. Yoda was like the Tim Duncan of the Jedi. Tim Duncan, who has been nicknamed as, quote, Mr. Fundamentals. Kobe Bryant famously said in his basketball documentary, Kobe Doing Work, that everyone knew what the San Antonio Spurs and Tim Duncan could and would do, but they simply had better execution at doing it than anyone else.
Because there's so much film done, there's so much scouting done, that teams know what you're going to run. But in this game, it's not knowing what you're going to run, it's how you execute it.
One of my favorite articles about martial arts, written by a gentleman named Myron A., illustrates the key importance of basics and the execution of those fundamentals. There is a reason forms and katas and sequences are in place to begin with, and that's because they are effective when studied over and over. As Bruce Lee would say, I do not fear the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And we have seen this from Yoda's track record. Even someone who uses Suresu, the dedicated defensive form of lightsaber combat, would be hard-pressed to compete with Yoda. Not only because of his speed, but because of his varied and unorthodox small man Ataru. Where fighters like Grievous or Sidious come in with overwhelming, one-directional speed, Yoda subverts flanks, constantly changing his attack vectors. And to conclude that Yoda's only means of victory is to fling himself like a cannonball to his opponent, to me, completely disregards the nuanced mastery of Yoda's form.
But his actual physical moveset does not vary. What you see is what you get.
Again, Jinsarai is establishing this narrative that Yoda has predictable movesets that should easily be contended with so long as one is familiar with Ataru and his movesets. Yet 3 duelists who knew all the lightsaber forms inside and out, Dooku, Mace, and Sidious, were not helped for it when contending with him blade to blade.
Which leads us to the question of whether Vader can contend with Yoda's greater speed and consistently intercept him with his blade. Yes, he can. That is exactly what his tight defense is designed to do. If he can deflect a firing squad's worth of blaster fire, he can keep up with Yoda's assault.
Based on what we've seen, as I've covered in his fight with Starkiller, or his other fights where he has been tagged by others, yes, Yoda can most definitely outmatch Vader's defense through his speed. Vader's ability to deflect blaster bolts does not somehow translate to a lightsaber duel. The same thing can be applied for all Jedi. Most Jedi can deflect series of blaster bolts, but still are taken down by an opponent's lightsaber blade.
If he can deflect a firing squad's worth of blaster fire, he can keep up with Yoda's assault.
That's an oversimplified comparison, as though a lightsaber attack sequence has the same attack vectors of a blaster bolt that has a one-directional trajectory. And that's also making an assumption that Vader has some sort of perfect defense, when that is not the case, as we have seen time and time again.
While Yoda is certain to successfully outflank Vader and score hits, Vader can tank the damage.
Again, as we've seen from proper cuts, Vader cannot tank all damage. Even from the sequence that he is showing here, this is an opponent well below Yoda's pay grade. If his argument is that Yoda would need to land several hits against Vader to effectively cut through, which isn't actually the case so long as Yoda is not attacking his pauldrons, then Yoda can certainly make that happen. It's not like Yoda would cut at Vader once and just stop.
and his own active maneuvering mitigates Yoda's ability to do this.
Now Jinsarai is suggesting that Vader's active maneuvering would somehow sidestep Yoda's. This isn't even the best clip to highlight this. Also, his maneuvering is nowhere near as active as Yoda. He even establishes that Vader's armor slows down this kind of maneuvering earlier in the video.
But the dynamic gymnastic maneuvers that he had favored as Anakin Skywalker were simply impossible for Vader.
Yet backtracks from that now. And though I know he doesn't use the canon in his videos because he is just on principle against it, we even see with his fight with Ahsoka Tano, a fighter who we can all agree is nowhere near as acrobatically active as Yoda, was able to hop and leap around him successfully and subvert his flanks. Though she was effectively batted away, she is nowhere near on the level of Yoda, and if Yoda were to do the same thing, he would effectively cut through Vader. And Vader's primary form would not help here. As Dooku showcased in the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Jimso's weakness was his lack of mobility. Yoda's flank subversion would eat this up. I don't want to go too far off and say Vader would be completely useless. Vader would not likely stay planted in a Jimso stance, as he did supplement his style with Makashi's footwork. But the truth is that his new style is largely planted to the ground.
The only proven way to deliver significant damage is by penetrating Vader's defenses directly and actually hacking into or impaling him.
I guess we'll just forget about this scene then.
Vader leverages his strengths in such a manner as to compensate for his weaknesses, where Yoda tries to override his weaknesses by leveraging his agility to the fullest.
Speed kills in a lightsaber duel. While the real-life confrontations of boxing or wrestling or MMA rely more heavily on longevity and strength, that is not the case for a lightsaber duel. In fact, it's not even the case for real-life sword fighting.
This is one of those essential fundamental aspects to address whenever you're talking about sword fighting. You don't need that much strength in sword fighting.
I'm not going to show the whole video, but he does go on to conclude that speed is more important than strength. The reason for this is because when using a sharp weapon like a longsword, cutting subverts great strength because the weapon is as sharp as it is. This is even more true for a lightsaber, which has almost no cutting resistance. It only takes a light touch to do serious damage with a lightsaber. If you are the first one to touch your opponent, you will more likely become the victor. Even with Vader's armor, as I've covered, this is not an issue, as long as you are not targeting his pauldrons. And yes, Schologrim also makes note about armored opponents.
And before you say brute strength is required to deal with armored opponents, no, it's not.
So speed should be more favored in this matchup than it is. Jinsarai seems to put overemphasis on Vader's strength, when in this kind of contest, it is far less important. When looking at a touch weapon, speed kills. And when we look at the speed of each fighter, Yoda takes the cake.
And for an untiring cyborg killbot tussling with a little old man.
Lowballing Yoda as a little old man? Forgetting what Force augmentation does for Yoda to make him so devastating? I suppose I should just use this clip to equate Vader to something similar.
I was looking for a kind of sword fighting that was reminiscent of what was in the movies that we'd already done, but a more energized version of it, because we'd actually never seen real Jedis at work. We'd only seen crippled half-droid, half-men, and young boys that had learned from these old people.
But his ability to influence the physical plane has waned, and he can only channel the Force for so long before he simply burns out.
While I agree Yoda has a cap to his Force output, to use this sequence with Palpatine to suggest this does not work. When Yoda faced Palpatine in that tug-of-war of the Force, they were both blasted back by way of equal power. Yoda's positioning is what lost him the advantage in that scene. If they were on a flat field, that contest would have continued.
When Yoda attempted to absorb and redirect his lightning, Sidious simply sustained his output, overriding Yoda's ability to contain it. Though both were hurled back by the ensuing explosion, Yoda was worse off in the end.
Again, he leaves out the context of their positioning on the pod, not giving a full picture of the fight. Instead, he chooses to dismiss Yoda as simply being, quote, worst off. While that was largely the case within the context of the novelization, in that specific sequence, that is not what is happening.
He wielded the Force like a tactical nuke, and was incapable of multitasking. Dooku exploited this weakness to facilitate his retreat in both of their engagements, forcing Yoda to choose between pursuing him or saving his allies from Dooku's death traps.
To say Yoda is completely incapable of multitasking because Dooku sent a several-ton pillar hurling at his Jedi comrades is again dismissive. As if Vader would be able to do anything different, as though Vader could lift that pillar and simultaneously pursue Dooku with a Force choke. Jinsarai already notes how difficult it is for Vader to multitask himself with his Starkiller fight example. So to use this example against Yoda just feels like more lowballing, without applying the same analysis to Vader.
but he is inexperienced at contending with equally powerful adepts.
Yoda being inexperienced with fighting Force adepts of equal power is true enough, but the reason for that is because no one during the time was equally as powerful as Yoda. And if Jinsarai goes on to argue that Vader is somehow equally powerful to Yoda, that's simply not the case. In terms of raw power, Yoda and Sidious are equals. We saw that from their tug of war, and as stated by George Lucas himself, Vader is only 80% of Palpatine's raw power, meaning he is not a peer of Yoda in terms of raw attributes. Skill is a different argument, but the raw power argument is as solid as it gets. So if one's argument is to say that Yoda does not do well against those with equal power, sure, you can have that. But Vader is not one of those opponents.
And in a direct contest of Force power, Yoda would no doubt win.
Alright, we agree there.
Based on Yoda's demonstrated performance against Palpatine, Vader's rapid-fire Force throws would be an effective subversion.
No, it would not, because he is trying to compare the offensive output of an opponent who has greater power, and thus, greater scale and fluidity over thrown objects than Vader himself. This example does not work as a one-for-one comparison, as he's trying to sell. He'll even go on to say that Yoda had no trouble with Dooku because there was a gap in power levels, but then argue that somehow Vader's power levels could breach that gap.
What it comes down to is this. Yoda has no experience tussling with Force wielders of equal or even comparable strength, Now
Jinsarai is suggesting that Vader has comparable strength to Yoda? 20% is a very large deficit of power in a 100% scale. I would not say Vader is comparable to Yoda's strength in the Force. That's like saying a B- is comparable to a A+.
Furthermore, Vader was preparing for an eventual confrontation with his master, optimizing his skill set specifically to combat other Force wielders. Darth Vader gets the edge as a Force wielder.
I'm still unclear about how exactly Vader overcomes Yoda with the Force. The suggestion I'm gathering is that he'll pelt Yoda with tiny thrown objects, as if Yoda can't deal with that, as he did with hundreds of droidicas. Ultimately, I doubt this matchup even comes to blows with the Force. Yoda isn't inclined to use offensive powers.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
And Vader would know that using his powers against Yoda would just be turned against him. But if an advantage should be given to anyone, it should be Yoda, because of the fact that he could actually retaliate against Vader, while Vader could not do the same against Yoda. Much of the verdict would just be a reiteration of the things I have highlighted before this, as for Jinsarai, it's just a reiteration of what he's been saying in the video prior to this. My main point of contention is Vader's ability to defend against Yoda's assault. I agree with Jinsarai that this matchup would be based on the early fight. If Yoda somehow cannot penetrate Vader before he burns out, he'll lose. We disagree that Yoda would consistently be incapable of doing so, based on the showings from Vader, which to me suggests he cannot defend against a Yoda assault, based not only on speed, but skill. And to say that Vader could defend against Yoda based on predictability, I turn to Dooku, Mace, and Sidious, who should have been able to predict Yoda's fighting style, yet they either conceded or were outright defeated by way of the blade. And as I said before, I don't see this ending by way of the Force, because Yoda isn't offensive, and Vader will be smart enough not to try anything. For Jinsarai to suggest that Vader gains some advantage through thrown objects isn't something I can buy, and to suggest that Vader is comparable to Yoda in terms of raw power is factually incorrect. And notice how Jinsarai does not highlight some of Yoda's feats for nuance, concluding that he is just some wrecking ball at the end of the day. Of the entire Jedi Council, Yoda was perhaps the best at applying physical enhancements through the Force. During a sparring session, while unarmed, he was able to evade Plo Koon, Saesee Tiin, and Deba Billaba, 3 highly skilled Jedi Masters within the Order, showcasing his masterful agility and timing. During the Clone Wars, Clone Commander Brolus observed how well Yoda used his body in combat. Facing against a Hellfire droid, Yoda evaded all of its missiles, but once the droid used his targeting lock, Yoda had to adjust his tactics. Instead of somersaulting away, as he did before, he turned his body into a corkscrew direction, forcing the missile to lose its lock, a maneuver Commander Brolus likened to a starfighter, much like we saw with Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith.
Grandmaster Yoda has been directly involved in the combat training of every single Jedi for the past 800 years, which has led those same Jedi to model their fighting styles on him.
This kind of irks me because it suggests that the failings of the other Jedi that contended with Vader could somehow carry over to Yoda as another one-for-one comparison. A band of Jedi who were substantially less powerful and less skilled than Yoda.
And because Yoda is the core archetype that every Jedi of that time frame is emulating, He is exactly what Darth Vader has optimized his skill set to combat.
And then to say that Vader was optimized to face Yoda, as an argument that he will defeat Yoda, does not work because Dooku tried the same exact thing.
I've become more powerful than any Jedi. Even you.
Dooku went against Yoda's teachings and went the route of Form 2, which made him deadly effective against just about every Jedi except Yoda, much in the same way Vader went on to be quite deadly effective against every other Jedi. Dooku knew Yoda's form, probably more intimately than Vader ever could, because they had a direct master-apprentice relationship. Yet Dooku earned no advantage for it. Dooku was so flustered by Yoda that he had to change his style completely just to cope, and Vader will be put under the same duress. And when Dooku tried his hand at overcoming Yoda with the Force, he failed. Vader has a different style but the same outlook against Jedi. He defied what they were and what they became, specifically fighting their archaic ways. But like Dooku, he hasn't done anything in his Sith career to suggest he'll do any better.
His battle precognition allows him to time out his strikes to intercept Yoda.
Out of nowhere, Jin Sarai gives Vader bonus points for having precognition, but seems to forget that Yoda also has precognition. Another case of unbalanced analysis, and again, he makes the suggestion that thrown objects will be an issue for Yoda when that would not be the case.
Yes, Vader is a similarly powerful and more subversive Force wielder.
No, Vader is not a comparatively powerful Force adept. That's simply not correct. And to those who turn to the head-to-head book as a canon backing for Vader defeating Yoda, and that Jin Sarai's arguments are backed up by this, you'll also have to look at the Darth Maul vs. Kit Fisto entry, which Jin Sarai thinks will go to Maul. Some of the matchups are specifically caused to stir up debate. That is why you have silly matchups like Darth Sidious versus General Grievous, which would be an utter stomp. I want to reiterate that I don't want people using my disagreements against Jin Sarai as a way to call him outside of his name or needlessly ridicule him. He created a fine video, though stylistically I do feel it's long-winded and wordy, but that's more of a personal preference. His video, and all his videos take time and effort, and that goes across anyone who makes versus videos in the YouTube community. You're a fan of Star Wars, and he's a fan of Star Wars, so relax. Though I disagree with his verdict and some of his conclusions of the characters and the way he uses, and doesn't use, the lore to back up these claims, I would never be nasty to him in any way, and neither should you. The way you conduct yourself in fan theory debates carries over to your real life, so let's all conduct ourselves as ladies and gentlemen. And don't just take what anyone on YouTube says at face value. That is why I apply sources and references throughout my videos and within the description box. Craft your own opinions based on your own reading and interaction with the lore, not someone else's. But that's it, no more ranting. Do you agree with my rebuttals? Let me know in the comments below, or vote in the top right corner. Peace, love, and may the Force be with you. Always.